I played every Star Wars Battlefront game. Part 2. That's right, welcome to Part 2 of my series where I play every Star Wars Battlefront game. If you missed Part 1, it should pop up in the corner of the screen, but I'll also stick a link to it in the description. In Part 1, I covered the first 2 Battlefront games and the cancelled Battlefront 3. In this video, I'll be talking about the lesser known games. In fact, I don't usually hear about these games at all in the Star Wars Battlefront discourse. First, I really want to thank my patrons for their support, including Melancholis in the Omega Gamer tier, and Brandon Wolf, Maycan Solo Coupe, and That's Just Ash in the Played Every Game tier, along with these absolutely legendary people. Thank you all so much for your support, it means the world to me. Alright, let's get into the games. Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron was released for the PlayStation Portable in 2007. Developed by Rebellion, who is nowadays best known for the Sniper Elite games, this is the first Battlefront game that wasn't a numbered entry and was built, to my knowledge, specifically as a spin-off, or at least a side entry. So right off the bat, visually, I've gotta be honest here, at first glance, this game is pretty rough, at least compared to Battlefront 2 for the PSP, which came out a couple of years earlier. The models are significantly toned down in quality, and the textures don't fare much better either. Supposedly the draw distance is a little better, which I can sort of see, but it's really not that noticeable. But I can get over lesser visuals. The big thing here is the gameplay. This feels like it's definitely inspired by Battlefront, but there are some really notable differences. Some good, some bad. For starters, the controls are a bit rough, but definitely passable for a PSP game. There's a couple of control scheme options, and one of them is reminiscent of the way Battlefront 2 on the PSP did it, but it still feels really off, and that's for one specific reason. The game has kind of an old school aim lock system, where you kind of automatically choose a target if you're aimed in their direction. However, it makes pointing the reticle at a target feel super clunky, since where you're aiming at almost doesn't matter. On top of that, if you aim up or down, it automatically centers the aim after about a second. Sometimes this is fine, but sometimes you're trying to aim a rocket at an ATST, and it instead automatically moves the aim to between the ATST's legs, missing entirely. This leads to aiming feeling really unresponsive. The core gameplay loop is the same in the Conquest mode though, it just feels really off to play. However, this game did have some really good ideas. First off, they got rid of classes entirely. Instead, you have a single customizable unit using a points system. The way this works is that you can now choose a primary weapon, a secondary, explosive type, special item like a jetpack or health and ammo drops, and then you have power-ups that work almost like perks. There's health, speed, and capture rate boosts too that give you a solid stat increase to that attribute. However, everything you equip has a points cost, and you can only have up to 100 points at a time. The more powerful or potent the boost or item, the more points it takes. However, this new system does give you a ton of player agency, and I personally enjoyed maxing out speed and capture rate, getting rid of every weapon except my primary blaster to make room for it. Another cool thing this game does, while not necessarily new, is the reintroduction of flavor dialogue from the units on the battleground. They now are just as vocal as ever, and it works wonders for immersion. This game really nails the atmosphere, and while the gameplay is clunky, the overall feel of the Star Wars world is definitely something they pulled off. There are 3 main single-player modes in this game: Instant Action, Campaign, and Galactic Conquest. Instant Action is functionally identical to how we saw it in previous games, which is comforting to see. The Campaign mode is, as you can probably guess, the story mode. You know, quick breakaway here. Sometimes I feel like an absolute dork describing the modes in games when I make these videos. I've actually had people point this out in the comments, but honestly, what am I supposed to say? The Campaign mode is the Campaign mode, but just imagine this. Why can't the Campaign mode be, I don't know, a mode where when you click the new game button, an X-Wing busts into your actual house, and the pilot in it is like, "Yo, let's go defeat the Empire!" And then you go on real space adventures. No? Okay, back to reality. I've got to hand it to this campaign. These cutscenes are super cool. They're made up of these animatics of these really big pieces of super stylized artwork, and they have full voice acting. The voice acting here is also really good, and the story is actually coherent and pretty interesting. It's about a squadron created by Han Solo that fought for the rebels. The game is broken into chapters, and it's a cutscene for setup, then a mission. It's definitely a lot like Battlefront 2's missions, but this game does do one thing better in my opinion, and that's the flavor dialogue. You've always got someone someone in your ear, but on top of that, what the troops on the battlefield are saying adapts to what's going on in the mission, and for a PSP game, that's a super cool touch. Initially, I wasn't really enjoying this game since I started with the instant action mode and couldn't help but to compare it to Battlefront 2. But the campaign actually changed my perspective a bit. Comparing this to Battlefront 2 and pointing out every little downgrade or change as a negative is a little unfair to this game when it does a bunch of things to shake up the formula. Sure, the controls still feel wonky and unresponsive, but they really hit it out of the park with the campaign and the story itself. The presentation isn't bad, it's just different, and it's enjoyable on its own. There was a different creative vision here, obviously, and I think it's just as valid as the vision for the previous Battlefront games. The final mode is Galactic Conquest. I'm gonna be honest, this mode kind of confused me, but I'll explain it to the best of my ability. In this mode, you choose either the Rebels or the Empire. Then you're given an overview of the galactic map. This has some fundamental design changes from how it worked in Battlefront 2. You now buy upgrades in tiers, and they're broken down as logistics, infantry, and space tech. You also buy commanders who are all actually really recognizable characters. These commanders have buffs themselves, like one causing your troops to regenerate health, or another increasing your credits accrual rate. There's a whole system where the commander has to be in the sector you're using the buff for, too. Galactic Conquest is broken down in phases, which makes this feel even more like a strategy game this time around. In the movement phase, you can change the planet that you occupy. When you occupy a planet, you can increase troop allocation on that planet, too. It's kind of like Risk, I think? Please don't fact check that. I do not remember how to play Risk. Anyways, if you make terrible decisions like I do, you can initiate ground combat when you're at a huge numbers disadvantage. Now, what's super cool is that you can actually play this outright like a board game because you don't actually have to play the levels. Instead, you can just have the game simulate the result for you, but then you don't get to hop in there and absolutely wreck the other team single-handedly, so I guess it's your choice. Actually, that is a good point I want to make. When you're at a disadvantage, it's entirely possible to just run in and mow down enemies to even the odds out. This is actually how I won most of my fights in this mode. All in all, this is a fun mode, but I imagine it would be a lot more fun against other actual players because that strategy wouldn't work so well. Also, this is both sad and hilarious. Out of all of these planets, Alderaan is also on the galactic map, and it's just a big pile of rocks. We know why, but that's still the funniest thing in the world. Why is it here? Finally, there are multiplayer modes here, but I didn't get to try them. There were online modes and ad hoc local modes, though. While I'm not entirely sure, I hope that Galactic Conquest was one of them because it would be fantastic online. Also, I just want to note that I do think Elite Squadron did this, but I never talk about it, and I'm noticing this in editing. I'm sorry. So, overall, Renegade Squadron is a decent game with some really cool ideas and a solid foundation, but at the end of the day, it is hindered by its control scheme. I think another game using this game as a base but with refined controls could be seen as much of a classic as the first two Battlefronts. Star Wars Battlefront Elite Squadron was released for the PlayStation Portable and the Nintendo DS in 2009. I'll be talking about both, but first I'll be talking about the PSP version. For starters, this game has a really cool intro. Well, it's more like the title screen to menu transition, but it's still pretty cool. Visually, this game not only has a much better draw distance than any previous PSP game in the series, it also has a massive visual upgrade from Renegade Squadron. I think this is the best of both worlds because the model quality and texture detail are comparable to Battlefront 2, but there's also this much nicer draw distance. I assume this is due to progress being made in the technology behind the scenes and the devs being able to squeeze more out of the PSP as time went on, though. As far as gameplay goes, this is an evolution of Renegade Squadron's gameplay. There is a nice improvement in that the UI makes it super obvious as to who you're aiming at, but under the surface it still feels very similar and kind of inaccurate. The aiming does feel slightly less janky because of this, but again, I think that's more of the UI. One big change I did notice, though, was that your character actually seems to physically punch enemies if you're shooting at someone right in front of you. I think that's a neat touch. Oh, and the unit customization is back, but this time some of the customization items are locked behind progression in the campaign. Space fights have slightly different controls, but also feel pretty similar. However, this game did something huge that I think should be standard in Battlefront. This game has planet-to-space battles. What I mean by that is that you can start the battle on the surface and then take the fight to space. I'll talk more about this in a minute. The game's modes are the same as Renegade Squadrons: Instant Action, Campaign, and Galactic Conquest. The campaign is by far the most interesting mode in this game, solely because of how interesting the story is. You play as X2, a clone trooper who was actually derived from the DNA of a Jedi. He doesn't know this at first, but the story unfolds in a super cool way. You start out as just a clone doing missions for the Republic, then you're helping in Order 66, then you defect and start helping the Jedi. It's a really awesome overall story, and I really hope we get a story like this in the future, because I'd love to see the possible implications of cloning Jedi in the wider universe. Heck, I'd love to see them just to adapt this story again anywhere. Clearly this is the Cliff's Notes version, and I imagine the full console version would have been more fleshed out, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I do have some complaints about the jank in this campaign mode though, including some levels feeling a bit half-baked, but a really cool overall story makes up for that in my opinion. The actual progression is similar to Renegade Squadrons in that you get a cutscene, then a mission, then a cutscene, etc. But this time we see full motion cutscenes and even some standard in-engine pre-rendered cutscenes. Of course, most of the full motion cutscenes are shots from the movies, but it's still great for world building and tone. Oh, and here's a cool little detail. As you progress the story, the main menu actually changes to reflect how the characters have evolved in their look, which is a detail that they didn't have to do at all, but I love this kind of thing. Moving on to Instant Action, it works as it has in the past, but because of the gameplay changes, you can now choose from 3 starting areas depending on the map: interior, space, and ground. Instant Action also has a distinct difference now, where one of the main objectives is still capturing command posts if you're playing Conquest, but now you also have a secondary objective of taking control of an ion cannon to destroy the shields of a capital ship. This allows you to board it and take it over. Interestingly, the ships themselves also have their own command posts inside, so the maps are almost like 2 distinct maps. It's essentially like they blended together the space versions and the ground versions of the maps like we saw in previous games. Finally, there's Galactic Conquest. This mode feels like an evolution of Renegade Squadron's Galactic Conquest, but the main differences are mainly visual. There's a new purchasable upgrade, which are called one-shot bonuses though, and while these are expensive, they're super helpful and super powerful. One of them skips an enemy player's turn, one of them allows the player to play as a hero for an entire battle, and one of them outright neutralizes an enemy planet entirely. This version of Galactic Conquest also has scenario missions which have specific objectives and difficulties. What I like about these is that they actually have their own opening crawl, which is a nice little extra detail, and it feels like one of those things, again, that the developers didn't have to do but chose to anyways, just to go the extra mile. There's a big elephant in the room here that I need to address about this game. This game is basically Battlefront 3 in about as complete a form as we'll ever get, and there's a ton of evidence that indicates this. The story campaign and the characters in it are exactly the same as what we saw in the alpha build of Battlefront 3 that I covered in part 1. This game also has the pseudo surface to space transitions, which is one of the things that Battlefront 3 had, and the maps even have some similar layouts. This game, at the very least, used Battlefront 3 as a starting point and was built from there. But the biggest piece of evidence is that if you look online, you'll find that this game was actually originally called Battlefront 3 when it was being developed. This is a fact that I wish I'd researched before I made the first Battlefront video, but it is great that I made a part 2 so I could address it here. Of course, there are some things that this game took from Renegade Squadron, and who knows if that would have been the case if Battlefront 3 was never cancelled, but I think it's for the best for this game. It serves almost as a spiritual sequel to Renegade Squadron with distinct improvements. Overall, Elite Squadron on the PSP feels like a fairly major upgrade to Renegade Squadron, and I definitely prefer this, at least gameplay-wise. The story mode especially is a huge upgrade and definitely worth playing, albeit there is some jank in there. Either way, this game feels more like its own thing rather than some weird attempt to emulate Pandemic's Battlefront 1 and 2, and for that reason it has its own identity. Like I mentioned earlier, Elite Squadron was released on both the PSP and the Nintendo DS. The DS version is significantly different in presentation and gameplay and was developed by N-Space, not Rebellion. The gameplay here is a huge departure from any previous Battlefront game and is what I can best describe as a top-down shooter more than anything. It's significantly more arcadey too. The entire aiming system is an auto-lock directional shooting thing that shockingly doesn't use the touchscreen at all. You tap one button to shoot, one to switch weapons, and 1 to throw grenades. The grenade's distance increases the longer you hold down the grenade button. Also, there's a dedicated roll button too. So since the DS has 2 screens, there's 2 screens of information here. The top screen is the main gameplay screen, and the bottom screen is sort of a simple map. Tapping on the bottom screen changes the camera height ever so slightly too, but I just left it on the furthest zoom setting a majority of the time, if you can call it the furthest zoom setting. Space battles are simplified from previous games, but still pretty impressive for running on a DS. It's fully 3D, but movement is only left and right. You can lock onto targets and fire one of 2 kinds of ammo types. It's super streamlined and simple, but it's still pretty fun for a game that's already pretty arcadey, and I think this is absolutely a solid adaptation on a system with the DS's specs. Visually, this game looks as good as it can for a DS game. The DS wasn't exactly a powerhouse in graphics, but this game definitely pushes the system a bit. The environments are mostly just flat levels, but there is this nice layer of depth if you go to the edge of the maps and look at what's below. On Kashyyyk, you can see these little wooden forts and other background elements, for example. The visuals of the space battles, which you saw earlier, are actually really impressive to me. While you can't explore super far out or anything, you can still see all these cool ships, space debris, and planets in the background, and it's all in 3D. Pretty nice looking for a DS game if you ask me. For the record, I do want to point out that at random times you'll notice that parts of the background, and especially space, have this weird red tint to them. That seems to be an issue with the emulator I'm using and not actually how this game looks. I can fix it by playing the game in native resolution though, so if there is at any point a drop in the resolution, that's why. Anyways, moving on. There's 3 modes in this game: campaign, instant action, and extras. Campaign mode is, of course, wildly different in gameplay from the PSP version, but it actually follows pretty much the same story beats, and it's told in simple dialogue boxes for the most part. It is done in chapters that are broken down by planet though, just like the PSP version, and you can also see an overview of the chapter you're about to start. I did notice that there were definitely some extra cutscenes here that weren't in the PSP version, and it really makes me wonder what would have made it into the main console versions of Battlefront 3. But speculation aside, these cutscenes are nice since I'm a big RPG guy, and I definitely can appreciate older style dialogue box cutscenes. In fact, I think that these cutscenes give it a chance to flesh out the story even more, but I'll get to that in a second. The artwork in these scenes is pretty nice, and it's a shame that they're all stuck on this tiny screen because I'd love to see the original versions, well, if they exist. Oh, and the campaign does this really cool thing where for some fights, there's a super zoomed in camera, which for a game that's smaller in scale on the DS is super awesome to me and adds an air of epicness to the overall experience. In fact, these one-on-one fights are super creative and some of the most fun I've had playing these games yet. I'm gonna say something controversial here though. The campaign mode in the DS version, in my opinion, is the superior campaign mode between the 2 versions. The story seems a little more fleshed out thanks to more dialogue in the text boxes, and while the set pieces are a smaller scale, they feel grander because of the limitations of the hardware. You actually get more context behind why some of the events that happen, like your brother turning to the dark side and your own character's unwillingness to aid the Empire. If you want to play an Elite Squadron game and you're doing it solely for the story and how fun the campaign is, play the DS version. Now on to instant action. When you start an instant action game, you actually have to choose the game order. You can drag around the order you want to play, and you can start planetside, on the capital ship, or in space first. And then you can set the order of the other 2 as well. I actually enjoy this kind of player agency in this mode, especially since all 3 games are technically one match. Planetside gameplay has you running around capturing command posts while you defeat enemies, just like standard Battlefront Conquest mode gameplay. Capital ship has you escorting droids to your base to get the most points. Space mode is just straight up a space combat deathmatch. Instant action has 3 different variations: free-for-all, team game, and hero mode. Free-for-all is exactly what it sounds like. There are no teams and you have to do every objective solo. Team mode is exactly like free-for-all, but you're, working with your team. Hero mode is a deathmatch where you can play as any of the heroes, though there's only lightsaber-wielding heroes in this game. Interestingly, hero mode is the most restrictive with the maps since there's only a couple available in this one. Instant action is also an optional multiplayer mode when you start it, in that you can host games, and when you start them, you can either play them solo or wait for other players to join. The last mode in this game is extras. In this mode, you can look at unlocked achievements, artwork from the campaign, and the game's credits. Overall, Elite Squadron on the DS was a massive surprise to me. Not only was the gameplay super solid, the campaign was a delight to play. The gameplay wasn't super deep or anything, but it was fun, and at the end of the day, that's what really matters to me. And And that's it for part 2. These games, for better or for worse, are the only remaining vestiges of the legacy of the original Battlefront games from 2004 and 2005. I don't think we'll ever see another Battlefront game with the kind of gameplay style that we know from the older Battlefront games, and while that is a shame, I'm glad they're still widely available to play even today. Of course, we all know what the next part is going to cover. Next up is EA and DICE's Star Wars Battlefront games, and these are good games, they're just controversial. That being said, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate everyone who watches these videos, and I really enjoy making them. If you liked this video, I would love it if you considered subscribing, and also make sure you check out part 1 if you haven't done that already. And of course, there's some videos right here that you might like to see too. As always, thank you so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.